Hello and welcome to Top of Mind, Florida. I'm Brian Crowley and I'm here with my co-host, Michael Williams. Never mind, Michael is still gone on vacation in Alaska, so I'm once again by myself, except I have the great Eve Samples with me today. She is the leader of Friends of the Everglades, and rumor has it that there may be some important issues that she's dealing with. Welcome, Eve.
Thanks, Brian. Just a few issues going on in the Everglades right now.
Keeping you busy?
Absolutely. Busier than ever.
So what's number one on your mind with the Everglades right now?
So your listeners may be aware of a mass detention facility that has been ramrodded into the heart of the Everglades over the past month in Florida, and that's kept us very busy. Friends of the Everglades is actually engaged in a federal lawsuit on that front because we're concerned about the environmental impacts and the flouting of federal law that occurred as this unfolded.
Well, the argument that Governor DeSantis has given is that there's an airport runway there. There's already concrete on the ground. Planes occasionally land there. That what they're building there will have minimal impact on the Everglades and on the wildlife, and that people who are complaining about it are complaining just to complain. And you would say,
I'm so glad we're jumping right into this. There's a lot to unpack here. First, let me say that this site is very much Friends of the Everglades origin story. We were founded by Marjory Stoneman Douglas in 1969 to stop what would have been the world's largest airport from being built at this very location. So Marjory was 79 years old when she did that. She had already helped create the national park, written the book Everglades River of Grass, and then she went on to found a group to help fight this.
and what many people don't know is she was a former reporter at the
Journalist.
Miami Herald.
She was. She did a lot in her life. She's
Yes,
an
she
incredible
did.
example.
Anyway, you were saying.
Yeah. So the reason there's this one runway out there that was largely abandoned is because the people of Florida, including Marjorie and Friends of the Everglades, rose up to stop that horrible proposal back then. And as a result, Big Cypress National Preserve was founded in 1974 around the site. A whole series of environmental protections emerged after that: the National Environmental Policy Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act. This was a time of environmental awakening in the country, late 60s, early 70s. And so this one runway has existed out there for 56 years, lightly used, with the recognition that we needed to protect what was around it, until about 4 weeks ago, a little more than 4 weeks ago, when the state of Florida, without any public input, without any environmental analysis, built this mass detention center in a period of about 8 days. And since then, we've documented the impacts. About 20 acres of new asphalt have been laid. This is in an area, the property is about 96% wetlands. So when you lay asphalt, there are impacts there. No analysis has been done. Light pollution out there now. It looks like a stadium in the distance where you once had incredible dark skies. That impacts species like the Florida panther. So a whole host of concerns about environmental impacts, and that's why we filed a federal lawsuit on June 27th.
So, to get just to the Everglades for a minute, I have this belief that a lot of people who live in Florida, many obviously coming from other states to move here, they hear the word Everglades, but they don't understand the Everglades. And even when I hear the phrase save the Everglades, sometimes I think they ought to be saying save what's left of the Everglades, because there's only about a third of it left, partly from development and other major causes. So why should people, and let's say probably 90% of Floridians have never even been in the Everglades, why should they care?
Even if you don't venture into the Everglades, and I would recommend that everyone do that if they live in Florida. I've done a swamp walk in Big Cypress, and it's one of the most incredible experiences I've ever had. But even if you don't get out there, there are a lot of ways the Everglades impact our lives in Florida. The Everglades and clean water in the Everglades, restoration of the Everglades, is integral to our drinking water supply in South Florida. More than 8 million people in South Florida depend on an aquifer that relies on the Everglades. Also, our tourism-dependent economy is based on clean water. And the Everglades isn't just this isolated national park down at the bottom of the peninsula. The greater Everglades stretches from Lake Okeechobee, east to Stewart, west to Fort Myers, down south to the Florida Keys, and getting the plumbing right in this vast interconnected system is really critical to clean water, not just in the national park, not just in Big Cypress where the detention center is, but in the estuaries in Lake Okeechobee throughout. So restoring the flow of clean water south is, in its simplest sense, what we work to do at Friends of the Everglades. And again, getting back to this thread of the detention center, to have it ramrodded into a really sensitive area, actually within the footprint of one of the Everglades restoration projects that's been authorized, could undermine this huge effort that we've undertaken for decades as a state and federal government and spent billions of dollars on.
So if you could sit down right now and have a cup of coffee with Ron DeSantis, and it's just you and the governor, what would you say to him?
I'd say, Governor, you can't have it both ways. You can't proclaim to be the Everglades governor and attend ribbon cuttings for projects and also push this detention center into the heart of the Everglades with total abandonment of environmental laws. We have some very common sense laws on the books. I mentioned that fabric of environmental protections that was stitched together 50 years ago. So one of them is the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. It requires the government to look before it leaps. Very common sense. When the federal government takes action, and this is clearly the state and federal government working together, they need to do an analysis to make sure that they're not undermining the environment, that they're not causing more harm than benefit. So for the governor to move ahead without that kind of common sense, it's really a conservative principle, would undermine his stated goals of being a Teddy Roosevelt-style conservationist. So I'd appeal to that side of him, and I'd also invite him out for a swamp walk. I think he needs to see that the alligators aren't going to devour us all.
So on that second cup of coffee, what would you compliment him about for what he's done in the past with the Everglades? And I guess there's a new reservoir being created. So.
Sure. So going back to my days in journalism, Brian, you were a journalist and I worked as a journalist before too. I covered some of DeSantis's earliest days in office. He was elected on the heels of a water quality crisis on the Treasure Coast and elsewhere. And he took office in early 2019 and he rolled out an executive order on the environment. I was there in Stewart one day when he had a press event on it. And there was some good stuff in that executive order. And I would compliment him on those stated goals, but I would point out that the follow through has been lacking. And in addition to that, we're seeing some real assaults on the Everglades over the past year or so, not just the detention center either. We've got a rock mine proposed in the Everglades agricultural area. Our state parks, including some in the Everglades footprint, were under attack last year. So there's a lot going on. But he has, whether it's because he loves the environment or not, or because it was a shrewd political calculation, he has spoken up and prioritized the environment during his tenure in office. And we appreciate that. And we need the follow through to be meaningful and science-based.
It's always occurred to me that one of the problems that the environmental community has is that they tend to be regional, where if you look at other industries, and ag being one of the biggest, they tend to be more united, where the environmental communities tend to worry about whatever's going on in their own backyard, and often are not united on the big picture issues. Why is that?
There are a lot of groups involved in the effort to restore the Everglades, and I think in its most fundamental sense, we are united around this concept to send clean water south. And the devil's always in the details. How do you get there? When do you accept a project that maybe falls short on the science? And we have a great North Star in Marjory Stoneman Douglas. She spoke truth to power. She didn't take crumbs from the table. She knew that if we were going to succeed at Everglades restoration, that we needed to follow the science and not compromise in ways that could be detrimental. So I do think there's broad agreement among environmental groups. It's always a question of whether you're willing to settle for the political win if it doesn't really satisfy the scientific and environmental objectives. And we are well on the record over the years pointing out things like the EAA reservoir, which was shrunken down through the sausage making in Tallahassee, just doesn't get the job done in terms of water quality, and we still need to acquire more land for that project.
How much of what's happening to the Everglades is the fault of local governments and developers?
Yeah, that's a huge threat in South Florida. So you mentioned that much of the Everglades has disappeared due to drainage and development. So some of that has been agricultural over the years. And of course, we're seeing the edges eroded away due to development. Unfortunately, every single legislative session in Tallahassee, we see preemption of local government's ability to uphold responsible growth. There was a time back when Bob Graham was governor of Florida, when Florida was a leader in terms of responsible growth and development. There was the Growth Management Act that was implemented in the 80s. And we've seen those protections rolled back over the decades. And all you have to do is drive down I-95 or out west of 95 onto rural streets, and you'll see there's development where there wasn't just a few years ago. So yes, it's a major threat. Every time you fill a wetland and put a building on it or lay down asphalt where there wasn't asphalt, there are implications to our waterways. And remember, we're actually sitting right now in the footprint of the Greater Everglades. We're in West Palm Beach, but this is the historic Greater Everglades. And what happens here has impacts downstream.
You know, they've been fixing the Everglades since the Clinton administration. And the progress over the last 30 years or more has been, some would argue, very minimal. And in fact, in that same period of time, more of the Everglades has been lost as opposed to protected. So explain to people, if the Everglades was dried up tomorrow, was totally developed, what would it mean to the homeowner, to the business person? What would it mean to people if all of a sudden the Everglades didn't exist?
Well, we would not survive in South Florida. The Everglades are integral to our future here, not just our water supply, which I already talked about, but our future in the face of sea level rise and climate change. Sending more clean water south from Lake Okeechobee to the southern Everglades helps mitigate for some of the impacts of saltwater intrusion in our aquifer. And there's also a carbon sequestration effect that wetlands have. Beyond that, just as somebody who appreciates nature, it's part of our quality of life in South Florida. You can spend all day, every day inside an air-conditioned building, but you're not really experiencing Florida. And a lot of people do move here for clean water and our incredible waterways.
I think a lot of people don't understand aquifer.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you come from New York, New Jersey, Michigan, wherever, aquifer is probably not a term you've heard very often.
Yeah.
So really what you're talking about is an underground, almost cave-like thing that's holding the 50 some odd inches of rain we get a year. People don't realize we get far more rain than most states, you know, and that's that plus the water that flows from the Kissimmee River, Lake Okeechobee, and flows south, and it's holding that water, and that basically is where we get our drinking water.
That's right.
So if we wind up damaging more of those aquifers, I think what you're saying is that, you know, these are the places that hold that water, that clean that water for us, that make it so that we can use it. And if we lose that, we're losing our drinking water.
Exactly. Or if saltwater intrusion becomes a compromising issue for the aquifer. So yes, it's integral. We cannot survive as a state without clean water and ample access to water.
Because I can remember a time in the, not long ago, where I forget who brought it up, but somebody was suggesting that we needed desalinization plants, which in a state that gets an average of 50 inches of rain a year, I'm like, we need desalinization plants? What do you think about that idea?
I mean, in Florida, it's feast or famine with regard to water, right? We have droughts during the dry season, and we have incredibly rainy, wet seasons. And that's why Everglades restoration, which, to your point, dates back to Bill Clinton signing the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan in 2000. It includes all of these projects, more than 60 projects that include reservoirs and water cleansing features, man-made marshes, basically. So Everglades restoration is all about getting the water quantity water quality and water timing right. So we need reservoirs to store water. We need filtration systems, man-made marshes to clean it. And then we need to deliver it to the right parts of the ecosystem at the right time. So it's simple in concept, but the execution is very complicated. And, I'll push back gently on something you said about no progress being made on Everglades restoration. We have more challenges than ever, that's for sure. But I do think we've seen some progress, mostly through the courts over the years. Friends of the Everglades actually was engaged in Clean Water Act litigation decades ago. And so the state is having to build man-made marshes and putting the final touches on some of those now to meet these water quality standards for phosphorus, because the Everglades really can't handle much phosphorus in the water.
So, correct me if I'm wrong. One of the great man-made mistakes we made with regards to the Everglades was building the Hoover Dike around Lake Okeechobee.
I think that's true, although I understand why that dike was built. I mean, there was
Sure.
a horrible, deadly hurricane that impacted the communities south of the
And
lake
hundreds
back
were
then.
killed.
Yes, I think knowing what we know now, there were better ways to address that flood risk. And I would argue that the biggest mistake we made is the drainage of about 500,000 acres south of the lake for sugarcane cultivation. And that's still happening today. That industry just got a big bump in protections in the big, beautiful bill. In fact, Trump's Secretary of the USDA was out in Clewiston a couple days ago celebrating the industry's protections. And you're seeing things in the news like now Coca-Cola is going to have more sugar in its Coke. And I
New
think,
Coke.
yeah, the sugar farmers are feeling pretty good. But we have to remember that we have paid a price for that footprint south of the lake. And we've also paid a literal price, more than $2 billion, to clean up pollution from sugar.
But we seem to be developing closer toward the Everglades faster than we're fixing. What's going to be the impact of that?
I think we need to bring some common sense back to our growth management practices in Florida. I actually live up in Martin County and Stewart, and we have seen some turning of the tide there. There was such outrage to what traditionally has been a slower growth community that we saw some changes last election cycle. To be clear, Friends of the Everglades doesn't engage in any election activity. We're a nonprofit. We can't do that. But that's just as a citizen up there, I noticed it, and I think that's happening around Florida. Once people get here, they tend to not want more growth, and this growth does not pay for itself, and I think there is an understanding of that. It's just a question of whether elected officials have the backbone to stand up to some powerful forces that promote irresponsible growth.
Well, for those who don't know, tell a little bit more of the story of Marjory,
Yeah,
because she was a phenomenal individual
she
with a
was.
fascinating history.
One of my favorite topics to discuss. So I knew a little bit about Marjory before I took this job 5 years ago. I grew up in Miami, born and raised in Florida, and I didn't really study her life until I started with Friends of the Everglades. So Marjory was brilliant. She wrote for the Miami Herald early in her career in the 19-teens, but back then women were kind of relegated to the society pages, and she wasn't satisfied with that. She wanted to dig into meatier topics. And one little anecdote that tells you really about who she was is she was assigned to find the first woman from Florida to enlist in World War I and write about it. And when she went to the enlistment office, she was told no such woman existed, so she enlisted herself. And she went on to serve in World War I, and that's Marjorie in a nutshell. If somebody wasn't doing it, she stepped up and she did it. After that, she came back. She wrote her book, The Everglades River of Grass, that really changed the world's perception of the Everglades from this swampy wasteland to be drained and conquered to a treasure that should be saved. She was a leading voice for creation of Everglades National Park. And then at age 79, founded Friends of the Everglades. And she lived to be 108 years old. And I am told she had a couple cocktails every day. So I don't know if that's correlation or causation.
You want to live long? Drink
Yeah.
more.
Yeah. So she's just a fascinating person. She was divorced in the 1920s, and that was scandalous at the time. She
Sure.
faced hardship too. She didn't have an easy life, but she did a lot.
She sure did. And you are following in her footsteps by
Trying.
leading the organization she founded. How does that feel?
It feels great. And whenever we waver on a policy decision or grapple with how to handle something, thinking about what Marjory would do is very useful. We have a great board of directors that feels the same way. So I'm honored to do this work and to, as Marjorie said, be a nuisance where it counts. So that's very much our ethos.
So you have mentioned a couple of times that you are a Miami native, born and grew up in Miami. And you also mentioned Governor Bob Graham. And I asked a previous guest about this. So Bob Graham, who I covered as a journalist, would always say Miami. So which is it, Miami or Miami?
To me, it's Miami. I was a child of the 1980s and grew up in North Miami Senior High School. It was a different Miami. But if you ask my parents' generation, my stepfather grew up in Miami. He went out to the Everglades catching snakes. So there's a little bit of a generational shift.
I think it's starting to die off, though.
Yeah, every now and then, there's some folks that we encounter who spend time out in the Everglades who are multi-generational Miamians. I can't even say it.
So what are your best memories about Miami?
I didn't realize how different Miami was from the rest of the country until I went off to college. But when I was going to North Miami, it was a Haitian immigrant community, and my best friends were from that community, and I was so grateful for the way I got to grow up and experience the world. So great memories there. Steve's Pizza, North Miami was a hangout. Just wonderful to reconnect with South Florida through this work now. I was a city kid, and I took my field trips to nature with school or sometimes family friends. But I've really gotten to experience another side of Florida through this work.
Where'd you go to college?
University of North Carolina in Chapel
University
Hill.
of North Carolina.
Yeah.
So you abandoned Florida to go to North Carolina?
I did, and then I went to Pittsburgh for a couple years, where my dad was from. My maiden name is Modulewski, so in Pittsburgh people can pronounce that, and Miami not so much. But yeah, Florida pulled me back, though.
Cool, very nice. So, you do have an advisor working for you, Tom Van Lent, who used to work for the Everglades Foundation, and he got into a very big dispute with the Everglades Foundation. He was their chief scientist, and as a result of that, wound up going to jail for 10 days. And he's an advisor of your organization. What are your thoughts about Tom Van Lent and what he's had to go through?
This has been a moment of painful irony, and I'll explain that in a moment. But first of all, let me just say I'm very honored to work with Dr. Van Lent. Anyone who's worked with him knows what a brilliant mind he is and how much he believes in restoring the Everglades. So we as an organization have stood by him throughout this really scorched earth litigation tactics brought against him by his former employer. And there's no there in terms of trade secrets, their allegations. That said, there was a painful irony in the moment when he was reporting for his 10-day jail sentence. This was the result of a contempt of court finding where he deleted private files from a computer he returned to the foundation, and we believe him and stand by him. But I was there when he was handcuffed and taken to jail. I was sitting next to his wife. It was a tearful moment for many people, even as we are fighting this detention center in the Everglades. And I won't speak for the Everglades Foundation. I'll just say it's very hard to understand why that kind of legal might was brought against someone who did so much good for the movement, and I think who will continue to.
What do you see as the future of the Friends of the Everglades?
We're growing. It's interesting. We've been around since 1969, but we had kind of a working board, very small staff for most of those years. I started 5 years ago. We had 3-ish employees, 3.5, I guess. And we just hired our 9th full-time employee. And we're hearing from a lot of supporters around the country. Actually, in light of our legal battle against the detention center, we're getting support from around the world. I think there's an appetite for pushing back against some of these forces of plunder, if you will, in Florida. So I think we're growing intentionally in a way that serves our mission. We're not just growing for growth's sake, and really trying to make a difference in the way that Marjory envisioned.
And where would you like to see the Everglades 5 years from now?
We launched a campaign earlier this year called Rescue the River of Grass, long before this detention center came on the horizon. And it answered a question: what would it take to finish the job? The EA reservoir was shrunken down. How much more land do we still need to clean water and stop the discharges to the northern estuaries, harmful discharges, and to send enough clean water south? And the answer is we still need about 100,000 acres south of the lake. But remember, there are about 400,000 acres in sugarcane cultivation. And also remember that the state of Florida has a land acquisition trust fund that voters approved in 2014. It's bringing in about more than $1 billion a year. So there's money there. And it's just a question of making it happen and political will. So I would hope that we're successful in acquiring more land south of the lake. It's the missing link. It's the piece of the puzzle that we've all recognized.
There seems to be an inability to elect more environmentalists to the state legislature, to, statewide offices, and sometimes even in local offices. Why is that?
It's a good question. I think in a moment of crisis like in 2018 when DeSantis was campaigning, he saw there was political advantage to speaking up for the environment. And the hard part becomes holding elected officials accountable in the off years, or when we don't have water that looks like guacamole and poses a public health risk. So I think the task for groups like ours is to educate the public about our connection, the connection that all of us have to a healthy environment, and then helping elected officials see that it's to their own advantage to vote in ways that serve that environment.
So what would happen if the legislature said, we're going to give you all the money you want, all the resources you need to fix the Everglades? How long would it take?
It would depend on the schedule. There are a lot of moving parts. It's a state-federal partnership. South Florida Water Management District partners with the Army Corps of Engineers. Now there's some talk at the state level about the state doing more. So hard to say, but I think we could have, if it's a priority, we could have meaningful progress in certainly a matter of years, not decades.
Is the Army Corps of Engineers a good thing or a bad thing when it comes to the Everglades?
That's a good question. So they control the floodgates from Lake Okeechobee. They do a lot of the big earth-moving projects, reservoir construction. I have seen personally a culture shift at the Army Corps with relation to Lake Okeechobee discharges in recent years. There's so much public outcry, especially in the Stewart area around that the Corps has responded. They created a new lake management plan that takes public health and the environment into account. As their name suggests, they're the Army. They take marching orders. The orders come from the top. So if they're instructed to work within the parameters of environmental protection, I think they'll do that. And it's a matter of what they're being told.
Is there a problem? I mean, the CEO of the Army Corps of Engineers in Florida, based in Jacksonville, they're usually only there for a couple of years. So you have this constant churning of who's in charge. And I think they sort of know, I just got to deal with this until I get my next assignment. Does that impede making progress with Everglades and Lake Okeechobee and the rivers and all the work that needs to be done?
Right. So the colonels that sit in Jacksonville serve 3-year terms. And yes, I share that frustration. As soon as they get up to speed and you really develop those relationships, then they're off to their next assignment. I've seen, though, that some of these colonels really do feel a connection to Florida. Some have been from Florida. Right now, Colonel Bowman is who we're working with. And I had lunch with him on the Indian River Lagoon at a restaurant on his 3rd day on the job, and I appreciated that outreach. And I think the onus is on us to help them see that they're public servants, and they are serving us when they make decisions that protect the environment.
Well, I think one of the things that you probably do is encourage people to visit the Everglades, understand more about the Everglades, and really, really understand what's at stake as if more harm comes to the Everglades ecosystem.
That's right. Yeah, getting elected officials or Army Corps colonels out on a boat or wading into the Everglades, there's no substitute for that. And Brian, if you want to go on a swamp walk, I'm extending an official invitation to you.
I'd be more than happy to go. We'll do an airport ride and the whole bit.
Yeah,
Maybe we'll
exactly.
capture a python along the way.
Yeah. I'll need a little help with that one, but sure.
Well, thank you very much for being here on Top of Mind Florida, and thank you for watching or listening. We hope to see you again.
Thanks, Brian.